For autistic people, recognizing or identifying your autism or receiving a formal autism diagnosis is a really big deal. But the process of getting that diagnosis can be really arduous and time-consuming, and there can be a lot of mistaken, wrong diagnoses along the way. So I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what your experience was of realizing that you might be autistic and going through that diagnostic process, Emily.
I was 16 when I found out that I'm autistic. That was kind of following a fair few years of very, very high anxiety and OCD symptoms. Then that started affecting my mood a lot. So I ended up in a psychiatric unit when I was 16. While I was there, the question of me being autistic was raised, and my parents had kind of started to wonder a little bit because my cousin's autistic and my auntie had been kind of questioning it for a little while. But then my doctor, he said, I don't think you're autistic, I think you just have high social anxiety. And this was after he sat down with my parents to ask them about my childhood. And they also completed what's called an SCQ, Social Communication Questionnaire, which is often a screening tool for autism. And I scored 4. Now, I think the cutoff is 15 or something, 15 or 16, I think is the cutoff. And then kind of 10 to whatever is kind of a maybe. But I scored 4, so I was really low on it. Yeah, they didn't think I was autistic, and I was still very unhappy and very distressed. So I was fortunate enough that my parents kind of paid for a private assessment, and it was supported by my community CAMS team. The lady said to me at the end, she said, I think there's one explanation for everything that you've been through, and I think that's autism. And the moment she said that, I felt so relieved, because it had kind of been years building up to that of just feeling so lost and confused and everything. So that was kind of how I found out. And I think sometimes it depends on the journey that they've been on, depends on who they've been around, what their kind of understanding is of it. But for me, it was definite relief, and I was quite grateful to the person that diagnosed me as well.
I received my autism diagnosis significantly later than that. I was 36 when I was diagnosed, so I'd gone through the process of school, university, starting my career, getting married, having 3 children, all completely unaware that I am autistic. And that had been a really difficult journey for me, because I'd had a lot of mental health problems. I'd really struggled socially. I'd struggled to start my career because of discrimination that I was experiencing because of the way that I was behaving, without anyone having any knowledge of why I might be behaving that way. On 3 separate occasions, I was hospitalized because of my mental health issues. And I was literally colour coordinating their cupboards for them, organising their shelves, and asking them if they could tell me specifically what was happening at what time each day. And still, I had doctors literally saying to me, we really can't work it out because you don't really fit a specific mental health criteria, but there is definitely something going on with you. In the end, they diagnosed me with cyclothymia, which is like a rapid cycling version of bipolar disorder, which I think they came to because I was having meltdowns and therefore was rapidly having mood changes. At some point, somebody also tried to give me a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, and I fully explored these diagnoses. I was like, great, give me the personality disorder questionnaire, filled it out, and they were like, yeah, you don't actually have a personality disorder. So I tried every psychiatric medication going, I tried many therapies, and I was still really struggling, and I did not know why. And then, in what is becoming quite a classic story, I had a child who was diagnosed with autism. Out for the day with my child, and I couldn't find a parking space, and I had what I now recognise to be an overload experience. And I honestly sat in the car, looked at my child in the back of the car and went, oh my God, I'm autistic. So no doctor identified this, no one signposted me, I literally realised it myself. But then I went through a kind of like, am I insane? Trying to give myself labels or trying to grasp onto something else. So I spoke to my husband and I spoke to my friends, and honestly the general reaction amongst my social group was, oh my gosh, did you not realise? I waited a really long time for an NHS assessment because I didn't have the resources to go private, so I waited for around 3 years. And within 10 minutes of meeting me, the doctor who assessed me said, this is not going to be a tricky one. Mm-hmm. And I was diagnosed in that appointment, and that was incredibly validating initially. I think we'll talk a little bit more later about how that kind of got processed over the next few years, but it did feel like finally someone has figured out this mystery that has kind of really left me age 36 really, really struggling.
I often work with people who are coming later to a diagnosis or coming from a complex, what we call complex background. And if I have someone sat in front of me that's got multiple labels already assigned, then my alarm bells go up, my red flags go up, and I go, okay, we need to spend time here. The first thing is you validate the person and hear them and listen and say, okay, if this is what you're feeling and experiencing, let's explore that together, and let's go through this in an in-depth and proper way. So I think that's the first thing. And actually, if in a sense, the later someone is coming to diagnosis or to explore the idea at diagnosis, there's going to be a lot of baggage, potentially trauma, but a lot of strategies that have been put in place as well. So you really need to give a lot of time and energy to exploring what their experience of life is, what they've had to do in order to fit in and get through life. So a lot of it is listening. I think, unfortunately, in a lot of assessments, it's a lot of asking questions, but actually we should, as clinicians, it's our job to really listen and ask more questions and listen again.
Because when I was asked about my special interests, for example, I explained that I was completely obsessed with dance. I wanted to be in a musical. And the doctor said, well, yeah, but I mean, that's quite normal. And I explained that I spent every waking hour thinking about dance and kind of went into the depth of that interest. But if I'd not been someone who is able to advocate for myself and explain the depth of that interest, I might have just gone, oh yeah, okay, right, and let that one slide.
So when you say interest, that's a really good one that I will spend a lot more time probing about in an assessment. So if a parent says, well, she's really into her Barbies, she's really into her Sylvanian families, that's what girls play with, or doing her makeup or doing her hair, then sometimes someone that hasn't been thinking outside the box and doesn't have the clinical experience to think, actually, we need to probe a bit more about this, or doesn't have someone sat in front of them like you, Ella, who's able to advocate for themselves, that might get fully missed. And again, around relationships and friendships, on the surface, it might look like they've got lots of friends, but when you go deeper, there's something else going on. It's not as straightforward, and it's a lot more tricky for them to navigate.
So I think it's really important, that being said, that we consider the role of self-identification and self-diagnosis in any video where we speak about autism diagnosis. And I think because of that kind of bias and difficulty once you're in the assessment process, because of the wait times, because of the fact that some people just simply aren't able to access an autism assessment, we need to find a way to support the aspect of our community that aren't able to receive the official stamp of you're autistic, if you like, but are autistic and have recognised that in themselves. Emily, how do you feel about self-diagnosed autistic people and how we could kind of include them in our community?
I think that having a professional tell you such an important part of your identity isn't necessary. You know yourself, and you know kind of your journey and what you've been through. For people who are self-diagnosed kind of with autism or kind of ADHD or anything, it's a lot of time goes into that, and a lot of unpacking kind of themselves and trauma and everything goes into that. It's not just something that they randomly see a TikTok video one day and go, oh yeah, I've got ADHD. It's a journey, isn't it? I just think, who are we to tell other people kind of who they are and what neurotype they have? So yeah, self-diagnosed autistic people are more than welcome in the community. I just know that sometimes they don't always feel valid themselves, and yeah, I wonder what we can do more about that.
People come to me, because I talk about self-diagnosis quite a lot, and people come to me and say, well, what about people who are wrong? As if figuring something out about yourself and supporting yourself in a way that makes you feel better could ever be wrong. The burden of proof is not on the individual. The burden of finding out who they are and how to feel good in the world, that's what we need to be doing. So anybody that's watching this video that is self-identified, you are valid, and we support that. When I received my autism diagnosis, I thought I'd be like, I'm autistic, great, on with my life, everything will be fine now. And what actually happened was the start of a processing time that I'm still in now, some 7 years later. Do you feel like the act of processing your autism diagnosis has been a journey for you?
So my initial reaction was relief, and I believed it. Processing what actually is autism and understanding what the diagnosis actually means. Then comes the whole of you just thinking about your life and about what's led you to that point. And with that comes a lot of things that you have to unpack, a lot of trauma. You think, is that because I'm autistic? Is that because I've misinterpreted certain things? Is it me? that led to this kind of certain situations. And that's hard to have to kind of unpack all of that, especially when you start to share your diagnosis with other people, or even just from people's perspectives beforehand. So I had a lot of meltdowns every day in the unit because a lot of things were changed and routine was changed. And the doctor wrote that Emily has hysteric attacks when she does not get her own way. And that is a line that has really just stuck in my head from my notes, because that's so often how autistic people, especially autistic women, are perceived, as hysterical. And I was called that growing up when I got upset and overly emotional by whatever had happened. So being told kind of by a professional that actually my meltdowns were hysteric attacks when I did not get my own way, which, to clarify, were when things changed, routines changed, you never knew what was happening, so much was out of your control, that I felt like I was being made out to be a selfish, manipulative person. And I don't think that was the first time throughout my life. So once you kind of understand what autism actually is and what it means for you and kind of how you are as an autistic person, how you function, then it's okay, well, what about all these moments that's led up to this? And that's hard. That's really hard. And I don't know if that journey ends. I don't know if it does. I mean, I'm kind of 6 years post-diagnosis now, and I know I've processed a lot in that time, but I don't know if that hurt and sadness will always be there. And obviously I was lucky to be diagnosed at 16 when so many people aren't, as you said yourself, till much older. So I try to be grateful that it only took 16 years, but I think about, what about all the stuff that could have been maybe avoided?
I think one aspect of receiving that diagnosis is maybe recognising where you are camouflaging or masking your autism, and you might not have even been aware that you were doing that ahead of either identifying or being diagnosed as autistic, and then you learn about masking and you kind of go, oh, am I doing that? And I think when I was first diagnosed, I genuinely thought that my goal was to mask more effectively. Like, now I know I'm autistic, I know where I'm going to get it wrong and therefore what I need to do better. And so for quite a while I was just trying even harder to overcome the autistic traits that I had. And then there was a period of time of being like, no, actually what I need to do is love myself as I am and be valid as an autistic human. So I just need to unmask. And now where I'm at is, I don't know what the heck unmasking means. I don't know when I'm masking, when it's safe to unmask, and who I even am at all, which is quite a realization in your 40s. And one of the things that I found really helpful once I've reached the point of I don't know how to unmask or who I even am, is looking at both books that have been written specifically by autistic authors about unmasking, contain like helpful exercises that I've been able to do to figure out when I'm masking, why I'm masking, and what impact that's having on me. But also reading books by other autistic people talking about their lives and the times that they've masked to relate to the experiences that they've had. Are there any resources, Hannah, that you have come across that you would recommend as great sort of tools for people newly diagnosed, being like, what does this mean for me now, to access and use?
Absolutely. So I'm a strong believer in post-diagnostic support. I'll offer what I call psychoeducation. So it's not therapy, because I'm not a trained therapist, but it's a very practical, supportive environment and a space where we look at what being neurodivergent means to them, because it is different for everybody. So we'll explore the aspects that might commonly affect people. Does it affect them? What their interests are? Does overload look like? Triggers? But also, particularly for older people that I've worked with, it is, I think, like Emily was saying, it's that unpicking of history, because actually what can come afterwards can be depression, anxiety, anger, which is a very, very valuable emotion to have, because you're thinking, why did no one pick this up? And if it had been picked up, my life could have been really different. So that is a really important process to go through. So I think it is important that we share with people that, yes, it can be a eureka moment. I have a variety of responses when I do feedback or when we come to a decision of a diagnosis. Often it's quite emotional. It can be anger, it can be disbelief. I had to learn that actually it's a very complicated journey, and it's not always that straightforward and that simple and that brilliant. We do sit and sometimes unpick things and have to go through the process of grieving as well for what didn't happen for them and it should have happened.
Sometimes when people find out they're autistic, they can then be accused of behaving more autistically, right? And I think that's partly because people are given permission to be themselves. It's partly because people recognise that if they don't behave more autistically, they are going to burn out. Do you feel like you became more autistic when you were diagnosed, Emily?
I don't think immediately, and I don't think it was a conscious thing, but my dad said to me, "You seem more autistic now than ever seemed before." And he wasn't saying it in a bad way or anything, he was just making an observation. We've spoken about it, and I think that I just reached a point where masking was just too much. And actually, because I knew I was autistic, I was able to try to start to unmask. And I've learned from everyone else around me, all of my reactions, all of how I do things, I've copied other people. I thought everyone did that. So to learn that, no, actually, some people do just have an instinct of how to react in social situations without copying what they saw someone do on TV last week. Learning that not everyone did that, I learnt that from someone else, made me question, well, then who am I? And what is me? And what's not? What's other people? And what's masking? I don't really know how I did it. It was more just giving myself permission. And because I knew and my family knew and everything, at some point, I guess I was able to kind of react more authentically as how I just wanted to act and not how I thought was right. Because being a massive perfectionist and actually I have OCD as well, and I've often get really panicked about not doing things right, needing to do it right because I'm autistic, but because if I don't do it right, something else might happen, and it's a whole load of anxiety. So giving myself permission to not have to react correctly in situations, especially if you're with people who know you. And that was the first step to being able to unmask a little bit. But yeah, my family say it mostly, I think, now, but not so much other people. Just my parents say, yeah, you seem more autistic these days, but it's not, they're not saying it badly, which I think often it is said badly. It's said kind of, yeah, you're putting it on because now you think you're autistic and now you're putting it on. But I was lucky not to kind of experience that.
Often when people are first diagnosed, they can also realise that they're like on the brink of burnout, or especially for those of us that are diagnosed late and have been maybe masking heavily for a really long time, you can reach a point where you're diagnosed and you suddenly realise that being this exhausted and this unable to cope with stress has a name, and it's autistic burnout, and it's almost inevitable that you'll be experiencing it, having struggled on for so long. And so I think there's this like period of time of being diagnosed where you can take the time within the amount of space and time and capacity that you've got to think about whether you want to unmask, to think about how you might want to change your life, and possibly also to give yourself some self-care and rest to recover from the effects of being an undiagnosed autistic person for whether that's 16 years or 36 years, because you're probably going to need that. If you found this video helpful, please like, consider subscribing to the channel, and check out the description box for more information.